Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, welcome to Point of View, the Millennial Roundtable edition. I am your host today, Chelsea Yeoman, and I'm so excited to be with you. We have a full show today, but before we get to our topics for the day, I want to introduce our special millennial guest who you guys are very familiar with. We have in studio today Liberty McCarter. She is a freelance writer and a writer for Point of View, so she is always incredibly knowledgeable about the topics at hand. So excited for you to be with us this first hour, Liberty.
Thank you, Chelsea. I'm really excited about our topics today.
Me too. I picked some topics because it's going to be just you and me this first hour. And as young women, working moms, and millennials, I thought we could maybe approach some topics starting from that viewpoint. So there was a very interesting article that came out in Politico that talked about really how COVID and the pandemic have changed the working environment for working mothers for the better. And so that's going to be our first topic today, one that I'm sure we have no shortage of opinions about because that deeply impacts our home and our families personally. Next up would be an article on the Federalist written by a dear friend of mine named Lauren Enriquez. She is with Students for Life, and she wrote what I thought was a really intelligent argument against a recent publication that came out on the AP that talked about how regulating abortion in a post-Roe world would negatively impact minority communities. And that article was filled with lies. And so Lauren said, let's bring some truth to the surface here. We have some counter data for that. And we want to equip you as our audience to really approach those arguments and have an understanding as people talk about the sky falling post-Roe, to say, actually, the world's going to be a better place, and here's why. So we've got some great statistics there. And then later on in the next hour, Richard Lim will be joining us. We'll, of course, be talking about the Olympics in China, some stats that came out about Americans being left behind in Afghanistan, and we'll, of course, end with the trucking industry and everything that's going on in the trucking protests. I'm really curious to get you guys' views on that. So let's dive right in, Liberty. I mentioned a little bit earlier that we'll be talking about, first and foremost, the impact COVID has had on flexible work time or flexible work environments, I should say, for women in the workplace. We all know that the studies have come out showing that some of the responsibilities that COVID has impacted has fallen more strongly on mothers who have children maybe staying home from school as schools are canceled, or, their children become sick. And some of these mothers have jobs. And so it's really required a revamp of the workplace for men too. Working from home is now part and parcel of our 9-to-5 jobs or 8-to-5 jobs. Flexible time, so working more after hours, after kids are asleep, as well as remote work, which is something that, really saves everybody time from their commute or getting ready, being able to just log on at home. But first and foremost, it's required an integration with the most important part of our lives, which are our families. I mean, every single one of us have been on a conference call where we've heard little ones in the background, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. We've all heard, tantrums in the background, or, said, okay, I've got to go get food for my kids. And that used to be, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, something when I had flexible work time that was an anomaly. That wasn't something anybody else had. And now it's, a really personalizing reminder that we are humans with families that are the biggest priorities in our lives. Do you agree, Liberty?
Definitely. And like you said, it's great to be able to work for places that value family life and prioritize that, but that hasn't always been the case for most workplaces, even the ones that tout their family-friendly policies. When you get into the work culture, it hasn't always been that way. So I'm glad that these conversations are happening now.
Yes, that's a great point. I think that I had the benefit of, I was in the law firm world before I went into the nonprofit world. And then I went and worked for some really incredible nonprofits that were genuinely pro-family. And I say that because it wasn't just what you said, which was on paper. When I had my first child, I said, okay, I have to go back and quit because there is no way I can work a traditional job and do what my calling at home requires. And they said, wait. Don't quit. What is it you need? And it was the first time I really felt like as a woman, I said, I can ask. There's flexibility. And so I said, I want reduced hours. I want to work from home around my child's sleeping and nap schedule. And I get all the work I need done, but it's going to revolve first and foremost around me feeling like my kids are getting what they need. And it was really beautiful to see that in very conservative, very Christian organizations, whereas in the legal firm world, the business and corporate world, no such flexibility was ever had. And so I think it's something I wanted to draw to the light here because this is not a conservative or liberal issue. This is a pro-family issue.
Right.
And so to be pro-family, which we as Christians are and we as conservatives are, requires that, we acknowledge women and men have different roles in the home. And because of that, if we want women to be able to work and have callings outside the home, which many women do, accommodating that they can do both well, there's nothing more pro-family than that, right, Liberty?
Oh, I agree. I agree 100%. And at the beginning of the pandemic, when so many people were all of a sudden working from home, I mean, people had kind of been theorizing about that for a few years. Like, what if work from home or more flexible schedules, like, is that the future? And then all of a sudden it was forced on us and said, it is the now. And so people were reckoning with this. And I actually wrote at the time back in 2020 when I was still writing for the stream that this would be, if this was adopted in the future going forward after people went back to work, this would be great. And not even just for moms, because as you said, men and women, we do often have different roles in the home, and with women having babies, and then, with things like breastfeeding, and then when the newborn stage, it is, we have a lot more to do with the babies that we need to be home for. But, even overall, fathers need to be involved in their children's lives too. So the whole family, parents and children, can benefit from employers that are more family friendly in their policies and allow that flexibility when it can be accommodated, when work can be done at odd hours or from home or things like that. And so, one of the things, though, that I really liked about this article in Politico, they talked about the different kinds of policies like parental leave and things like that are important. But I was really glad they focused on the need for society to become more family-centered, because you can have all the right policies in place, but people never take advantage of them if we still, as a society, value work over family life. And so I think more people are realizing we actually need a shift to recognize that family is important and should be our first priority.
You raised such a good point there. I'm really glad you pulled that out of the article, because it's easy, I think, to sometimes get lost in the wokeness of some of the language that the left uses. I mean, the most pro-family policies, I hate this, but they come out of the Seattle law firms, the most liberal corners of our culture. And paid family leave is something that we know is actually the number one thing that women cite needing to have abortions for if they don't have paid family leave. We're talking about essential hourly workers who are largely impacted by these leave policies. We want to give them freedom. We want to give them flexibility. And you're right, it stems all from us valuing families. And that's something that the right can own, Christians can own, and something we'll talk about when we get back from this break.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Inflation may not be good for most Americans, but it certainly helps the federal government. The editors of the Wall Street Journal put it this way: the country may be upset with inflation, but in many ways, political Washington has never had it better. The pandemic has been an excuse for record government spending and the abuse of regulatory power, such as vaccine mandates and eviction moratorium. But there is another reason. Increasing income tax revenues have been pouring into the federal treasury. Federal receipts from the first fiscal quarter, that is October to December, have increased by a remarkable 31%. In other words, it's been an increase of $240 billion to $1 trillion for the quarter. Much of the increase comes from individual income taxes, while much of the rest comes from an increase in corporate income taxes. The reason for those increases is easy to explain. Inflation increases the nominal GDP. In fact, the 7% increase in inflation led to an increase in the nominal GDP by double digits. That leads to higher nominal profits, wages, and salaries. With such an increase in income to the federal treasury, you might expect that we'd be closer to balancing the federal budget. But you probably already know the answer to that assumption. The federal government still has a $377 billion budget deficit in the first fiscal quarter because federal expenses increased. That fact should be enough to explain why the federal government doesn't need a tax increase. We can't even balance the budget when an unexpected $240 billion comes into the federal treasury. Inflation may not be good for you and your family, but it has been very good to political Washington. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back to Point of View, the Millennial Roundtable, where Liberty McCarter and I, your host, Chelsea Yeoman, have been discussing how the changes in the work environment and expectations at work, things like flexible work hours, working from home privileges, and also maybe more family paid leave or acknowledgement of health crises where people need to be home for health reasons. All of this has allowed more of an integration between people's family lives and their professional lives. And I think it's a really drawn light, as Liberty mentioned earlier. I agree with her on prioritizing family and the role of the family at work. It humanizes families. We all know our coworkers' kids or have seen them or heard them on the background of phone calls now. And all of this has really led to what I would say is a good thing out of the COVID pandemic. And I'm going to highlight that. I want to also focus, though, here on something that this Political article found, because I want our listeners, everybody here, to know that some of the good policies that could come out of this are going to be coated in wokeness and, the dog whistle, virtue signaling of the left. And I don't want good policies to get drowned out by the left trying to own that with things like, talking about equal rights and women's rights in the workplace, when there really could be some good policies that come out of it. So one of the statistics that I'll highlight here is that according to one of the Morning Consult polls for this article, 62% of Republican women and 56% of Republican men want paid leave to remain in Biden's big bill. And so this is something that I think should be a bipartisan issue, and one that is an opportunity, even if you're not in the nonprofit space, which sometimes does afford more flexibility. If you run your own company, or you're a small company, or you're in management at a company, to advocate for the women that work for you, it helps you keep strong talent, professional talent, because they can go find this type of flexibility somewhere else. I think it's good for retention, but it's also just good policy, isn't it, Liberty? You mentioned, valuing family in a societal way, and this is a really easy way that won't impact the bottom line. It won't impact work ethic. And I think personally, as a woman, I found it enables me to have a more powerful work product, because I'm doing it on my time, in a time that works for me, when I'm my best, but can also give me that freedom of headspace to be with my children at the same time. Have you found the same for you, Liberty?
Oh, definitely. And I've been very blessed in that regard to be able to work for organizations that allow that sort of flexibility. And I think, again, like you said, oftentimes these family-friendly policies are promoted by the left. And so conservatives may automatically recoil because they think, oh, well, is that good? And there are a lot of economic arguments about whether or not the federal government should subsidize, parental leave. But I would say, as a mom who has two kids, one of them is less than a year old, that time after giving birth is really, really important. And if you look at statistics, more time off work that women have with their newborns results in better health outcomes for both moms and babies. And in fact, there was actually one study that showed that less than 8 weeks of paid leave is linked to a reduction of overall health status and increased depression for moms. Every additional week of paid leave reduces the likelihood of poor mental health, and longer paid leave significantly increases things like rates of breastfeeding, which is really important for newborn health, increases or reduces the chance for even things like low birth weight and preterm births. And so there are a lot of reasons why it's important to support parents, and especially mothers, after they have a baby. But we can do that without saying, okay, well, now you just have to quit work, which is what a lot of women end up doing. And this, can be detrimental to their family, because women do have something to offer outside the home. I truly believe that. And so, if we say, hey, we're going to support you while you have your baby, we support your family. We are pro-family. We're pro-children. We want more. So yes, have your baby, take time off, and then come back, and we'll work with you to accommodate, your schedule so that you can be as productive as possible while still taking care of your family. That's going to result in better product, like you said, because instead of being stressed out, we're actually have the freedom to work whenever it's best for us. Results in healthier children, healthier families, which is what conservatives are all about. So there are a lot of benefits here that we need to think about.
That's so true. And also thinking about the impact that the article discussed the impact that COVID issues and problems at school are having on working class moms. There's a lot of single moms who are the breadwinners for their children. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of moms who chose life, but they're hourly workers, and they're incredibly impacted by their ability of their child to go to school and them being able to keep those hours at work. And so, I think just for everyone out there to be cognizant of, outside our wheelhouse or maybe even our industries, there are benefits to moms we care about out there, and women in society who do need assistance. They're not in a dual income home, and protecting them. And I said this a little bit before the break, but I do want to hone in on the paid family leave being such a huge thing for moms choosing life. My organization, Human Coalition, they're serving women seeking abortion day in and day out. And they'll say, how can we help you? What is one of the reasons you're seeking an abortion? And non-paid leave is top 10 on the list every time. Women are saying, I'm already an hourly worker. 60% of them already have a child at home, dependent on them. And they said, if I can't afford to take off 8 weeks or 12 weeks at work. And so just being aware how these policies could impact other things we deeply care about as Christians, like moms choosing life or feeling like they have the ability to do that. Really beautiful policies we can consider as holistic support for the family unit. Let's not let the left own own this one. This is something that the right and Christians in society as business owners can actively participate in, and it can be intimidating. You know, I, as a female attorney, am 1 in 3, right? Most attorneys are men, and I'm often in the boardroom with all men in the boardroom. And we advised a company that's such an incredible company. I like them so much. And they were intimidated to ask me. They said, okay, at the time I was pregnant, and they said, how do we help moms without it seeming awkward or uncomfortable? And I said, it's okay to acknowledge that I'm a woman. Like, it's okay to acknowledge that I'm going to have a baby and I need time off with that baby, and that there are differences. You know, there are biblical differences between men and women and men and women. And this is just a part of that. And it's so funny that the left, you know, in this article said, well, studies are showing that women play an outsized role in the home. And we as Christians are laughing, saying, we've always known that, you know, mothers have an important role. That's not to say men don't as well. But I think it's a really powerful statement to be able to enable policies and bring some of these flexible things that we've now learned in the last 2 years into permanence, into our working style, and trusting the women that you work with or for, or are their bosses, trusting those women that they'll continue to perform like they always have, and they're going to continue to knock it out of the park. But turning now to our next article, which is abortion related. It is, for me, it was a really resounding piece. We've got only a minute here before the break, but I'll introduce it. The AP came out with a piece that talked about, in a post-Roe world, you know, minority communities are going to bear the brunt, and there are going to be all these negative impacts on minority communities. And my dear friend over at Students for Life, Lauren Enriquez, published a counterpiece that I thought was really powerful. It is on our website at pointofview.net. If you want to go read any of these topics or more, don't forget to go there. But she said, the truth is minority women do have the highest abortion rate nationwide, and that's because the abortion industry targets minority women. You may or may not have heard this before on our show, but 80% of Planned Parenthoods are within walking distance to minority communities. They have a very, very sordid past related to racism. They have eugenicist roots in Margaret Sanger, their founder, and they purposefully wanted to, quote unquote, eliminate what they would call, I mean, I can't even repeat the words, it's so horrible, but eliminate minority populations from our midst. And in large regards, they've been successful at that. Now, decades later, we now know that almost half of the Black population is missing in our country because of abortion. In certain regions, like in certain neighborhoods in New York specifically, Black children have a higher, there's a higher rate of being killed in the womb than of being born. And those are devastating statistics, and ones I think that are really important to bring to light when you're having these conversations about how much the abortion industry really targets minority communities. Did any of these statistics shock you, Liberty?
Yeah, I think what is most shocking again and again when you're dealing with the pro-abortion industry, which isn't pro-choice, it's pro-abortion, is that, they're arguing, if abortion becomes harder to access, or if abortion is banned, it's going to harm these communities who need abortion. And then you want to say, and as Lauren points out in this article, well, why do they need abortion? What are the reasons that they're citing for abortion? What are the root causes that are pushing them there?
Right. More on this right after the break.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, welcome back to Point of View, the Millennial Roundtable. I'm your host today, Chelsea Yeoman, and Liberty McCarter and I have been breaking down this article that came out in in the Federalist paper, which you can go to pointofview.net and read this article or any other of our other topics on the show today. But this one specifically was, I thought, a very intelligent response to some arguments that came out in the AP about why, if Roe is overturned, it's going to hurt minority women. And that's just blatantly false. And so Lauren Enriquez, who drafted this article, she went through case and did a case support study for basically why it's actually true that abortion continues to harm minority communities. The most obvious reason being that it kills minority children. Almost half the Black population is missing. And we discussed a little bit earlier that 80% of Planned Parenthoods are within walking distance to minority communities, and that's not an accident. So, Liberty, we were talking before the break, and you were mentioning how you think there's better solutions out there for minority women who are maybe facing dire circumstances. I do think abortion rates tend to be higher for women who are in poverty circumstances or of lower income, and that abortion is not the only solution for those women. In fact, abortion kills their children, but there are better ones out there. Can you expand on that?
Sure. Yeah. If we want to address the real need among these communities that are having the highest rates of abortion, then we need to ask, why are they seeking abortion? And instead of just saying, well, we need to make it easier for them to get rid of, babies, say, no, why are they seeking abortion in the first place? And something you mentioned earlier that this article points out is that 76% of abortion-seeking women say that they're seeking abortion because of their circumstances. And kind of going back to something we mentioned earlier in this hour about the lack of unpaid leave and family life support for a lot of working class women. I've actually known women, our church, we help a lot of pregnant and single moms. And I've known women, even in our small community, who have actually been fired because they became pregnant while they were working, or they asked for very simple accommodations, for just their own health while they were pregnant. And instead of accommodating them, their employers fired them. And so this is the reality that a lot of people are facing. And, a lot of these women that seek abortion, they already have children. And so they're worried about providing for them if they lose their job, or how are they going to afford another one? And so regardless of whether or not abortion remains legal in the United States, as pro-lifers, our job is always going to be, how can we support these families? How can we equip communities, equip churches to really not just encourage women to choose life, which we should, but after they choose life, say, okay, and here is how we're going to come alongside you and help you change your circumstances so that you don't need to be seeking abortion in the first place. And so that's what we need to be looking at.
You hit the nail on the head, Liberty. One statistic that comes to mind is many of you may have heard criticism from the left or media on the left that says, the pro-life movement is pro-life or pro-birth, but not pro-life. Mm-hmm. And we know that that's fundamentally false. The pro-life movement is established on love and has 5 decades of building out pregnancy resource centers, crisis pregnancy centers, nonprofit charities that serve women with real solutions and real options, help women get jobs, help mm-hmm. women find childcare. So I think that one statistic you might want to know is that those types of organizations, those charitable organizations that do not profit, by the way, off these pregnant women like the abortion industry does, they outnumber abortion providers 4-1. So there's an incredible infrastructure in place, ready to go. The key is to continue to engage those infrastructures. I saw some statistics this week where, an article came out arguing against government funding towards those types of charities. And they were like beating their chests saying 68 million across the entire country went out last year to these nonprofit charities that serve pregnant women. And I thought, the irony, from the social services left doesn't want these women being served in other ways. When you consider that there are almost $700 million annually going to Planned Parenthood alone. Wow. I mean, it's a drop in the bucket. And so to continue to advocate, I think, for even government programs that support these women and say, let's help these charities out would be a really important thing. And then to finally note, one thing I thought we should talk about, Liberty, from this article is that they talked about as an argument for abortion that it will improve somehow, that it will impact high infant mortality rates in Mississippi. And they said, Black infants in Mississippi are nearly 4 times as likely as white infants to be killed in an abortion. And that's sad for any infant, right? But the AP argued that Black infants were about twice as likely as white infants to die during the first year of life. And of course, we've got to know that the ultimate irony in that is that if you allow abortion for Black infants, then they're still being killed. I don't understand the logic to the left's arguments there. But it's worth noting really some of these statistics that stood out to me. What did you think about that?
Yeah, again, that's just kind of shocking too. The argument of like, well, we're having a hard time, I guess, meeting the health needs of certain communities. So let's just kill them before they're born. And then, that will solve the problem. That's, really offensive when you think about it. And I think it gives pro-lifers, like you said, the pro-life community is doing amazing work, reaching women, helping women all the time. The pro-life community is not just pro-birth. But I think, for us, we can also say, okay, what are areas that need our help? And so when we look at, communities where there is high infant and maternal mortality rates, or there are major health needs that are not being met, we can say, okay, let's go work on that. Let's equip, centers in those communities that are going to specifically target those women who are struggling in that area or whose children, really need the extra nourishment and nutrition, and say, okay, well, we're going to actually solve the problem and make their life better, not say, oh, let's just kill you before your life even starts.
You're so right, Liberty. I think one resource I would just encourage everyone to go to is my organization, because I love my organization. It's humancoalition.org. You can learn more about the support we have for women, but you could also look up your local clinics. You could volunteer your time if time is what you have, or you could donate money if money is what you have to your local churches. Just continuing to work on building a culture that is pro-life for these single moms when they find out they're pregnant, that they know where to go, right? That these moms aren't just Googling Planned Parenthood. They're going to their church first. And to also, I think, note that 1 in 4 women who have abortions are sitting in our pews. They're in church with us. This is not something that is outside the walls of our church. This is something that's pervasive in our own personal community. So don't be afraid to engage and just raise your hand in your own church and build out something to help support those women sitting in your pews next to you that you might not even know every week. So that's what I would say. Anything else you want to add on that, Liberty?
Yes. Yes, your Human Coalition, amazing organization, and employing the amazing Chelsea Yeoman. I would say another organization to plug is Embrace Grace. I'm involved with that one on a volunteer basis with my church. And if you're looking, speaking of helping women in the church and in your community, Embrace Grace, they equip churches to really love on single pregnant mothers, single mothers that already have children, and even single dads now they have a group for that. So if you want to look up Embrace Grace to see how your church can get involved in a hands-on way, that would be a great organization to look into.
So helpful, Liberty. Well, we're going to turn now to our last topic of the hour, because you and I have not gotten the chance to discuss the trucker situation. And I was really excited to talk about this with you. We are going to go to one of those breaks in another minute, but I'll introduce it now. Everybody knows by now there's a massive procession of trucks, and they've created traffic jams along multiple port entries between the United States and Canada. And I think most recently, the Ambassador Bridge connecting Windsor, Canada to Detroit, Michigan has been blocked officially. And that actually represents about 25% of all U.S.-Canada trade. I just think this whole phenomenon it's creative, it's interesting. There's a lot to dissect here. But, I'll start with the fact that it's a massive traffic jam. And then we all know that the farmers have officially joined. If you don't know, there's a procession of massive tractors that have also joined, and there's protests everywhere. And there's a lot of backlash that they're facing, both from the Canadian government entities and the local city officials, and judges. I think there's now a judge that ordered they cannot honk because it's disturbing people who live in these areas. But it's certainly one of the most creative protests I've ever seen. What about you, Liberty?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. It's definitely raising a lot of attention around the world. I don't know, I have a few thoughts about whether or not it's sustainable long term. I guess we can get into when we come back from the break, but it is interesting for sure.
It's very interesting. It's something that we'll talk about more in just a minute, so don't go anywhere. You're listening to Point of View Radio.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back to Point of View, the Millennial Roundtable, where Liberty and I, your host, Chelsea Yeoman, are discussing the trucker convoys that I honestly never thought of I would ever see in my whole life. I mean, this type of protest is so interesting to me. It brings out all my First Amendment, lawyer nerd hats that I like to wear, Liberty. Because these truckers, they are blocking the roads. They're blocking. There's a port right now in Detroit that's about 25% of our commerce. And it's really impactful. It's making a statement, not just in Canada, but in here. It's garnering the attention of their president and our president. The Prime Minister of Canada, by the way, responded by calling these guys a bunch of violent racists, which I thought was completely ironic considering he's been wearing blackface in the past multiple times, has been caught with that. So, this is just a lot of virtue signaling on both sides, which is simply him over there using his wokeness signals to cry out to the progressives and really defame these truckers who by all accounts are largely peaceful. They've been joined now by farmers and tractors who are coming and essentially saying, get rid of these mandates. We've seen the UK lift all vaccine, mask, and COVID requirements. We're seeing certain states do the same. New Jersey and other states are lifting even school mask requirements. You know, we've all kind of predicted with midterms on the horizon in the United States, there's going to be some kind of declaration of victory over COVID for the Democrats because they desperately need a win. You know, Liberty, what do you make of all these dynamics?
Oh, wow. It's a lot, Chelsea. I would just say I was looking really quickly at some latest news updates, and there are copycat protests with truckers and vehicles popping up in France, down under in Australia, and some planned for the U.S. So this is gaining traction, gaining momentum. But, you know, it's interesting because I'm definitely anti-vaccine mandate. I'm not anti-vaccine, but I think it should be a personal choice for people, not something that is forced on someone who may have an objection to it. And I am definitely pro peaceful protest and demonstration. And so, you know, people are going to speak out about when they feel like their freedom is being taken away. I'm also pro order. So, you know, when in the last few years, we've had some pretty volatile protests in the United States, a lot of which have included blocking off highways and roadways from more progressive causes. And that has, you know, caused a lot of people to, not like that and say, well, hey, you might end up hurting a lot of the people who actually agree with you because they're just trying to get to work. They're just trying to go, do their job, provide for their family. But your demonstration has gotten so out of control. It's cutting off people being able to go around about their daily lives. And I know that we already have a lot of supply chain issues going on around the world because of the pandemic. And so I have to be honest that is a little bit of a concern for me about people who maybe are sympathetic with the truckers, but they, are stuck, or maybe ambulances can't get through. All those practical considerations are things that I think about. But, it does garner more of a thoughtful response from the Prime Minister of Canada, I think, than just accusing them of all being racist, which isn't true. So, there's a lot here. And those are some of my thoughts, Chelsea. I don't know.
I know those are really good thoughts, because I've been thinking about the same thing, in the free speech realm. You're allowed to have free speech in public forums like sidewalks and streets, but to the extent that it's a public safety hazard, there's actually some limitations there. So I'm actually just curious from a legal standpoint, which maybe you are, maybe you're not. If it is a speech protected type protest, because of the things you mentioned, there are ramifications beyond just the truckers and the points they're trying to make. I can't help but think, Liberty, it's still drawing out some hypocrisy on the other side, because the other side was willing to shut down free commerce and entire industries for non-essential workers. I mean, they did shut down society, schools, and I think it pulls out some of that hypocrisy in my mind and really points it out in kind of an interesting way. I heard one trucker who was interviewed go on to say, they said, well, how long are you going to do this for? And he said, only 2 weeks, just to flatten the curve. And it was such a moment where I thought, that's exactly true. We're now 2 years in, and these industries have had enough. Like, these truckers do not want to be mandated to have vaccines in a climate, like you said, that is already having difficulty, and in an industry that is already responsible. There's inflation issues, and all of those supply chain issues that you mentioned. It certainly exacerbates that, but it also goes to show it's similar in my mind to the hypocrisy of saying hospitals are going to lay off non-vaccinated nurses and staff and doctors in a time where, in the middle of a pandemic, they're short staffing themselves from services being able to serve the community. I mean, some of these things are just nonsensical. So I like that it's creating a stir. I like that it's creating a conversation. Another irony I thought it pointed out, was how much the left is coming against these truckers, who by most accounts I think are peaceful. I have not seen any real violent accounts, but for other movements, they're willing to pass on, right? Like the violence of the BLM movements, riots in the streets, burning down buildings. For some reason, those types of protests are given a green light. Did that stand out to you as well?
It did. And I think that just goes to show, for me and my cause, and, things that keep my side in power, I'm willing to turn the other eye and say, no, this is an essential protest. This is important. And, no, it wasn't that bad. For the other side, this is an act of treason. This is an insurrection. So, yeah, you do have to call out the hypocrisy. And so the challenge is to stay consistent and say, okay, do I really support free speech? Do I support protest, whether it's something I agree with or not? And if there is, happens to be illegal action or something that I think is getting out of hand, regardless of what the cause is, am I willing to call that out? So I'd love to see more consistency across the board. But I do like the point that you brought out that it does show a lot of hypocrisy with the, government saying, oh, well, everything's being shut down, even though they were willing to do that before. So hopefully it does cause some conversations and maybe some more thoughtful responses from the government. I noticed some regions in Canada are starting to lift mandates, some more conservative regions. So I think a lot of people are realizing that it's time to do that.
I hope so. That's my final question on this topic for you. Will it make an impact? What will the Prime Minister of Canada do in response? Do you have any predictions?
Well, the cynical side of me says they're just going to each kind of burrow down in their own sides and then use it to bolster their own political gains next time of saying, look at these radicals that we're having to deal with. And instead of maybe giving in where it makes sense, allowing people to suffer instead of, and saying, blaming it on the truckers. I don't know. It would be great if it did spur a productive conversation, but I kind of think that it's all for show and everyone's just going to dig deeper into their own side.
You might be right, Liberty. I'm going to be curious to watch and see, especially in a climate where everybody else is starting to loosen up these restrictions and lift them. Maybe it's just time, I would hope, for them to listen. But I'm proud of Canadians. Look, they're taking a stance here for democracy. I think that's beautiful. I'm proud of Australians who are protesting. When freedom is at stake, after all, it's always a valuable thing and valiant effort, I think, to support and be willing to defend. So I personally was moved seeing pictures of everybody just being willing to stand up for their own rights, which have been trampled in a lot of different realms already in Canada and different issues. But for them to take a stand now and say, no more, we're done. I thought was really interesting. I'm glad to see people finally standing up. You can go read any of these topics or more at pointofview.net. Don't go anywhere. After we get back from this short break, Richard Lim will be joining us all the way from California. He's got a great historical perspective, so stay tuned.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, hello, I am Chelsea Yeoman, your host today for the Millennial Roundtable, and we've had a robust discussion already, so if you get the chance, go back to the last hour and make sure to catch up on all the topics there. But I have with me in studio is Liberty McCarter. She's a freelance writer and writer for Point of View, so thanks for being with us today, Liberty.
Thank you, Chelsea. We're having a good time.
We are. And now joining us for the first time today is Richard Lim. He's with Prager University, but also the producer of This American podcast. He's always got an incredible voice. Really glad to have you joining us today, Richard.
Thank you. This American President podcast.
Oh, I might have misspoke. Sorry. This American President. Okay. Go download it. We'll hear more about that a little bit later in the show, but we're going to start with talking about the Olympics being held in China right now. I know this is a topic that a lot has come to the surface on in the last week. Olympians are submitting videos of conditions that are subpar, of food that is subpar, and there's a lot to be said about how we got here, why are the Olympics there, and what could have been done about it. A little bit later in the show, we are going to talk about a new report that came out on Americans who were left behind in Afghanistan that exceeded some initial estimates, of course, that the White House had put out. So that's some things that we have to address here. We've got to bring all this to light. And then we'll end the show talking about some of the military moves that Putin is making in Russia. And finally, we're going to give you the floor for a sound off at the end of the show on President's Day. I love hearing what you have to say about President's Day. It's really unique and important, I think, for our audience to hear. So now let's start with the Olympics. Senator Tom Cotton, who I think is an incredible voice in the Republican Party. He is a Harvard Law grad, served in the military. I mean, the accolades I could give him as a public servant for our country and a patriot, I could go on and on. But he wrote an article in National Review he called it China's Shameful Olympics. And he said kind of what we're all saying now. We heard Senator Marco Rubio out of Florida come out saying he's boycotting watching the Olympics, and I think it's a question we've all had because, as Senator Cotton mentions, the games should not have been held in China at all. They're going to get a good economic boost from the games, and they have a lot of money to make on the games. And in a country that has so many humanitarian crises, I can't even begin to include them all on a list, but some of them are genocide in certain regions of Muslim populations, concentration camps, forced sterilizations and abortions. I mean, the evils of this regime go on, and Senator Cotton mentions those first and foremost. And it doesn't take much as a viewer to look at the Olympics and some of the scenes. There's one picture of the skiing section, and it's carved out of like this gray dystopian type factory. And it really is bringing to light how gruesome and horrible the regime is when you look at things like that. Do you agree, Liberty? I mean, what are your initial thoughts when you're starting to see these images coming out of China?
Well, I think it's important to note that China is going to use the opportunity to host the Olympics as just a big, outlet for propaganda. And that's what people have to be watching out for. And then some of the imagery that we're seeing coming out, hopefully that will actually combat some of their own propaganda to say, look, communism not working out so well over there. But if you do want a list for any of our listeners of just some of the, major problems right now, some of the major human rights abuses in China and why it's such a problem that they're hosting the Olympics, you can actually go to pointofview.net. There's a free fact sheet on the website at this time that you can download and share to learn more about what's going on in some organizations that are combating that. So I'll just plug that real quick for people who want to learn more as we are discussing this topic.
I'm glad you pointed that. I mean, the goal here is to, of course, equip people to think about these issues and then speak and advocate on these issues. Richard, when you see all of the real crisis that we see happening in China, what were your thoughts on the games being held there?
Well, people often make the comparison to anything similar to what was happening in Nazi Germany, and in many ways that's a great simplification. But in other ways, it's appropriate because there are things that are similar to what was happening at the time. And in 1936, the Olympics were held in Berlin, and that was the famous Olympics where an African American named Jesse Owens basically won the gold medal and was basically a repudiation of everything Hitler stood for. And the way I look at it is that Liberty is absolutely right, is that regimes use these events to normalize and promote themselves. And that's the reality. Senator Cotton's comments criticizing President Biden's diplomatic boycott are right on point. And this diplomatic boycott is really a typical strategy that the Democrats use when they're in office. It goes back to President Obama, basically taking half-hearted measures just to say that you did something without actually doing anything that really matters. And that's how President Obama handled everything from Afghanistan to Iran to Russia, China, Al-Qaeda, ISIS. And that's how they're handling China right now. And I think Pelosi's comments where she said that American athletes shouldn't speak out because, quote, the Chinese government is ruthless, it makes no sense. Under that logic, the people who spoke out against the gulags in the Soviet Union or the Poles and the Jews who spoke out against Hitler were fools for doing so because it's their fault that they provoked the tyrannical government into anger. And I think it really shows the moral confusion right now in the Democratic Party.
It does, but it's also something that I don't think is just moral confusion among the Democrats. I would add, I even heard from a friend this morning when I mentioned something about Olympians are starting to talk about the conditions they're under, saying, well, that sounds like fake news. And this is just a normal person going about their day who has no idea how truly abhorrent China is and the conditions that are there. Like for me, that's on brand that people are not being fed well or living in subpar conditions. But to many people out there, they're just not aware. China is not something that major media outlets typically cover in a truthful way, which is why, of course, we're talking about it here. I thought that Senator Cotton did a good job bringing out really 3 options that could have been done right now. In addition to the diplomatic boycott, he said, yeah, that's one thing. But as you mentioned, it has no real teeth, Richard. In addition, they could have done an economic boycott because, as we spoke about a little bit earlier, China stands to gain some economic ground by hosting the games there. We do so much trade with them. They're such a part and parcel of our corporations' activities in America here. Nobody is willing to speak out publicly about China in America, at least in the corporate realm. So those were a few things he recommended. Additionally, he said that though maybe we should have pulled our athletes from going at all, which we were all reticent to do after all of our athletes' hard work. Real quick in the last minute we have, Liberty, would you have kept the athletes at home or do you say send them?
Well, I hate, it's not their fault how the international committee decides to host, where they decide to host the Olympics. So it does seem a shame to keep them home. But I was alarmed at some of the things Senator Cotton was writing about the risks to them over there right now.
Oh, more on that when we get after the break. What is going on now that we are actually in China for the Olympics? Stay tuned.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Inflation may not be good for most Americans, but it certainly helps the federal government. The editors of the Wall Street Journal put it this way: the country may be upset with inflation, but in many ways, political Washington has never had it better. The pandemic has been an excuse for record government spending and the abuse of regulatory power, such as vaccine mandates and eviction moratorium. But there is another reason. Increasing income tax revenues have been pouring into the federal treasury. Federal receipts from the first fiscal quarter, that is October to December, have increased by a remarkable 31%. In other words, it's been an increase of $240 billion to $1 trillion for the quarter. Much of the increase comes from individual income taxes, while much of the rest comes from an increase in corporate income taxes. The reason for those increases is easy to explain. Inflation increases the nominal GDP. In fact, the 7% increase in inflation led to an increase in the nominal GDP by double digits. That leads to higher nominal profits, wages, and salaries. With such an increase in income to the federal treasury, you might expect that we'd be closer to balancing the federal budget. But you probably already know the answer to that assumption. The federal government still has a $377 billion budget deficit in the first fiscal quarter because federal expenses increased. That fact should be enough to explain why the federal government doesn't need a tax increase. We can't even balance the budget when an unexpected $240 billion comes into the federal treasury. Inflation may not be good for you and your family, but it has been very good to political Washington. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back to Point of View, the Millennial Roundtable, where we are discussing the Olympic Games being held in China and a few things that are coming out now that our Olympians are there. You know, Senator Cotton wrote this piece in the National Review that said really there were three things we could have done. In addition to just a diplomatic boycott, we could have had an economic boycott of the games, or we could have not sent our athletes over there. And some of his arguments for that I thought were really astounding. Now you have to understand, he as a senator involved in national security committees is going to have a higher knowledge really of what actually, how China operates and what's actually their capabilities while people are over there. And he mentioned a few things in here like, we did not guarantee. He wrote a letter to President Biden asking for guarantees of our athletes' privacy and security, especially because of things like the fact that we have a travel advisory right now at a very high level for even going to China for Americans. So some of the safety concerns he mentioned are that their rooms can be monitored and bugged, that they are monitored at all times, their electronics are hacked. They're requiring health tracking apps, and he mentioned specifically that they have a high interest in maintaining people's genetic information, and so they might be using COVID testing and other, certain health precautions as a guise for getting more information about our athletes that are over there. And not to mention, second on the list that stood out, which I want to hear both of your opinions, Richard and Liberty, on these things, is there's been warnings from Nancy Pelosi even about potential hostage situation or speaking out, not speaking out against the Chinese government while you're there, because the Chinese government said, if you do speak out, we will arrest you. You know, all of these things really, I think, have to be brought to light and continue to be spoken about, even though the national media might not speak about this, because we want you to know and our friends and our family to know what it's really like over there. Richard, when you read this list, you know, did anything particularly stand out to you?
Well, it reminded me a bit of what happened in 1980. The Olympics were in Moscow that year, and President Carter was in office, and surprise, surprise, a weak president invited aggression. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and in protest, Carter basically withdrew American participation. So all those athletes that had prepared for years didn't get to go. And that was also the same year that the USA hockey team defeated the Soviet Union, the Soviet team. Oh,
wow.
You know, that is such a legendary event. And honestly, as an American, I think we should go there, and I think we should be even more motivated to, you know, win gold medals. I think that's the classic American way. But at the same time, I think that there are two different responses here we can have to tyranny. One is to just get along to go along, and China has incentivized every business to do so. You're looking at organizations like the NBA that are basically bought out by the Chinese government. And the question is, how far are you willing to let them act and commit atrocities against their own people just to make a dollar, just to make a buck? I think it's a real tragic situation. Last thing I'll mention is that China is creating a social credit system that basically turns their whole country into it's almost like a Matrix-like dystopia, where everything you say is rated and monitored and will determine what kind of loans you get, what school your kids go to. And if we say nothing about that, then that's going to become a reality, and it's not going to be good.
Very true. Liberty?
Yeah, I think, you know, if we aren't concerned about our athletes over there, even if, as Richard said, you know, going there and doing, you know, well and winning gold medals is great. But the bottom line is that the Chinese government is not trustworthy. And as you mentioned, a lot of people just don't really know what's going on over there. But there is really genocide happening specifically with the Uyghur Muslim population. I think a lot of people don't realize that this minority in China is being shipped off to basically concentration camps, to what they call, I think it's education and training centers, which should really raise a lot of red flags for anybody. But, you know, there have been reports coming out from the Heritage Foundation, from the U.S. Holocaust Museum, saying that this is genocide. The people who are being put in these camps are being subjected to forced sterilization, sexual violence, enslavement, torture, separation from their families and their homes. As well as there is also Beijing's clampdown on Hong Kong and silencing people there who are trying to defend their rights and their freedoms, and people are being arrested for speaking out. And so, you know, on the one hand, you know, you see why people are saying, well, don't speak out. There might be repercussions. On the other hand, all the more reason to speak out, because if we don't speak out at this point in time, millions of people are losing their freedoms and losing their lives, and this cannot be.
Yes, if nothing else, I'm hopeful that hosting the games there is drawing so much more of a discussion on China and how horrible things really are. You know, we're certainly talking about it now, and so it's good for us to be aware. I wish we could apply pressure to our elected officials to do more, which is why I was so happy Senator Cotton, you know, pointed to things that could be done, especially on the economic boycott side. When President Trump did that a few years ago and did take a hardline stance against China, you know, they did respond. And so maybe that's something we can apply pressure to our elected officials to work on. But we're going to turn now to drawing light to kind of another area, different part of the world out of Afghanistan. that I think these stats could get buried, and so I wanted to draw some attention to it. But a new report came out from United States Senate Republicans that really came out with some hard and fast estimates on how many Americans were actually left behind in Afghanistan after that debacle of an exodus that occurred in August. And the Republicans mentioned that at first the White House had said maybe 100 to 150 Americans had been left behind, but they found a discrepancy in the report based on some previous reports. And so it's a horrible gotcha moment, but essentially the original estimates, there were between 10 and 15,000 Americans in Afghanistan, and the evacuation effort evacuated about 6,000. We now have that number. And so this report said we still have an estimated of between 4 and 9,000 Americans remaining in Afghanistan. As we all are aware, many of them are Christian, and it's really horrific, the things that are coming out. You know, some of the nonprofit organizations on that part of the world who kind of are watchdogs and monitor what's happening to Christians in different areas are saying they're in hiding and trying to flee for their lives essentially at this time. So I don't think these numbers, I mean, I do think they actually surprised me a little bit. Richard, did they surprise you when you saw how this discrepancy was this large?
Well, so I think the answer is yes and no. Yes, in the sense that 4 to 9,000 people in 2022 can be left unaccounted for somewhere. Americans especially is surprising, but no, in the sense that it's a measure of the chaos that's happening there. For the last few months, ever since we pulled out of Afghanistan, I've been posting articles about it because it's one of those things, it's a news item that people are already forgetting about, and Americans tend to, not really think about foreign policy until something big happens. Last month, the Taliban kidnapped about 40 people in a city called Mazar-e-Sharif, and 8 of the women that were in that group were gang raped. And the women who survived were subsequently killed by their families in honor killings. Organizations from Human Rights Watch to International Christian Concern are reporting that LGBT Afghans and Christian Afghans are being hunted. 2 days ago, the Washington Post reported 2 women's rights activists have been abducted. And I'm saying that all to say that this is something we need to own and realize what the repercussions are. And let's not forget, this was a direct result of a callous administration that left Afghanistan for no good reason. The American presence there was low cost, involved virtually no casualties. People forget that incurring small costs like these in the world are an investment in peace and security. So it's really just another example of just what a disaster the situation is there.
You're so right. It has been 6 months, believe it or not, since that occurred. And it's one of the reasons we're revisiting this now and continuing to try to keep it in the headlines, because we need to know what our elected officials are doing. And I know this deeply impacted many Americans who were watching at the time. But one reminder is that they had 115 days to do an evacuation and instead waited until the 11th hour and conducted it in less than 2 weeks. And because of that, there are thousands and thousands of Americans still in Afghanistan under these horrible conditions. So it's something we should be aware of. When we get back after this short break, we are going to talk about the impact that that's had on the Biden administration and his approval ratings, and really the world's view of our country on a foreign scale. So stay tuned. Don't go anywhere after this break.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, welcome back to Point of View, the Millennial Roundtable Edition. I'm your host today, Chelsea Yeoman. I'm so grateful you're listening to us. If you want to go back and listen to the other topics we've discussed on the show, we would be so happy for you to do that. Go to pointofview.net, or you can also watch live on Facebook at Point of View Radio on Facebook. But with us today, I have Liberty McCarter and I have Richard Lim, and we're really talking about some of the tragedies that are surfacing out of Afghanistan. It has been 6 months since the exodus that happened, or however you would talk about that happened in August of last year. And now new reports are showing that up to 9,000 Americans could be left in Afghanistan, which is significantly of a higher number than was initially reported at the White House, which said maybe 100 to 150 were left behind. We now know that not to be the case. So Liberty, Richard did a great job really telling us some of the things he's heard has been happening over there and did a report on that recently. What are your thoughts?
It's devastating, honestly. And I'm glad that people like Richard and you are raising awareness to this when it is so easy for Americans to forget as we go about our daily lives. But, one of the things in the article you posted, I believe from Christian Post, was saying that, now the Taliban is going door to door, specifically looking for Christians, torturing people and trying to force them to convert to Islam. Which is not a surprise behavior from the Taliban. But again, just a reminder that this is what people are dealing with from a foreign policy standpoint. It's embarrassing as an American that it was handled this way. It's definitely not going to ingratiate us to our allies to say that we left so many allies over there, not to mention our own citizens, our own Americans, thousands of them potentially being abandoned to these kinds of conditions. And I would just say, as it's a reminder, as Christians, we can't always depend on our government to do the right thing, but the Bible calls us to remember our persecuted brothers and sisters in Christ. And so it's important for us to keep up with what's going on, even if the government isn't doing a good job, if they're trying to cover it up, to say what's the real story, how can we pray for those people who are left over there, and look at organizations like International Christian Concern that are trying to help people abandoned over there and see what we can do to help.
Yes, I love to hear about, the 501c3 nonprofits or the NGOs that go over and are trying to provide aid and assistance. We do have brothers and sisters over there facing so much. And so I just wanted to continue to keep this in your hearts and minds, something at the forefront of your minds when you're thinking about ways to get involved, but also not to forget these things when the midterms come in a few months, and to understand that there are very real life and death implications to our leadership here in America. And it's not a joke, and it's not something that only impacts, our economy here or issues that we do care about here. It also impacts internationally our own citizens. And so I'm going to move on now in other foreign policy debacle news, because I just got to talk about it. But you may have heard that Vladimir Putin is making war. I mean, he has moved 100,000 troops to the Ukrainian border, and he has started an internal Russian propaganda campaign to try to bolster support for what seems to be, I hope not, but might be an inevitable invasion of Ukraine. He internally is saying things like that the United States is supporting Ukraine, that we have said in response to all of these military moves that he is making, that we could potentially shut down, the pipeline that goes to Germany that Russia makes a ton of money off of. Unfortunately, Germany did not back us as strongly as President Biden said it, because Germany also relies very heavily on that natural gas pipeline, as does much of Europe. So there's a lot to unpack here in the next few segments of this show. I'm really glad I have Richard, you here to back me up, and Liberty, you here to back me up. But, thinking through our international reliance interests continuing to be on countries like China and Russia that are unpredictable, communist regimes, not to mention the humanitarian crisis we've already unpacked on this show today. But this type of reliance on these countries for our economies, it continues to become an issue when those countries have an inflated sense of power and authority and are ready to really utilize that and wield that against Europe, our allies, NATO, and, the United States. Richard, am I getting it right?
Yes, absolutely. So I visited Russia in 2009, and I actually traveled the Trans-Siberian Railroad just as a backpacking trip. It's probably a little crazy that I did that, but it's one of the most fascinating things I've ever experienced. Russians are some of the nicest people I've ever met. Their country's history is amazing. They've suffered as much as any group of people have suffered, and I'm not just talking about the cold winters there. I can safely say that their government feeds them propaganda and has been doing this since the 1940s probably, that tells them basically that the the U.S. CIA is orchestrating every single event in the world that Russians don't like. And the Russian government has one of the most sophisticated misinformation campaigns in the world. There are reports of the same people appearing in Russian news reports, in different news reports, because these people that are being interviewed on the street, they're the same people. Their fake news is an art. It's an art or a science, whatever you call it. They have a very sophisticated system there. The news is very manufactured. And whenever any group of people in or near Russia speaks out against Putin, they're essentially labeled as American CIA stooges. And whether it happened in Ukraine or anywhere in the former Soviet Union, that's what happens. And it's easier to blame an enemy than to actually deal with the real problems in that country. That's basically how things work in Russia. And so it's absolutely no surprise when all they hear from their news sources is, oh, they're Americans, they're doing it again. You know, there's a problem here. It's the Americans' fault. And that's just Putin's MO.
Yes, it's interesting when I read that information in the article about their propaganda machine that they have over there. It did surprise me because, one, I thought, why would Putin care about public support? He is, after all, a dictator and has rigged his own elections and therefore been in power for decades. Why does he care about the public support as a communist dictator? Is it just kind of an insurance policy?
Yeah, to an extent, a guy like Putin does have to care because every dictatorship, even though a dictatorship doesn't have to worry about the same things like public opinion polls to the same extent, there is an inherent instability in a dictatorship. And that being that people are willing to accept a certain amount if they're going to get something out of it. If they're going to get stability out of a dictatorship, okay, sure, it's better than chaos. We inherently like security as humans. But if anything ever threatens that, if people in the country start seeing how much better life is on the other side of the world, things like that, they'll get discontent. That's what happened in the Cold War. So Putin does have an incentive to create an enemy to blame his problems on, as opposed to taking ownership of them.
Well, it's interesting you say that because this article also drew to light the fact that citizens in Russia that they were speaking to are still more concerned with their own economy, much like Americans are, and their own well-being throughout this COVID-19 pandemic. And so, the question I have is, I wonder if it will actually work. I know that the Russians do listen to the propaganda machine that their dictator perpetuates, but they still might be distracted enough by their own lives during this time to really want to focus on Ukraine. My bigger question for you, though, Richard, in this segment is, why do we think that Putin is so determined, it looks, to have a military affront in Ukraine? I know he's very upset Ukraine is attempting to join NATO and therefore would be a very close North American, ally to his border. But that seems to be, the real catalyst for this most recent move in Ukraine.
Yeah, well, I think the fact of the matter is there's a lot of history behind it, and there was a time where entire Russian civilization was ruled in Kiev. So for many Russians, Kiev and Ukraine and Russia are really they're linked. Their histories are linked, and there are a lot of Russians in Ukraine, and they see these countries as the same thing, and that they should be united, much in the way China looks at Taiwan and says, well, this is our history. This is, we're all part of the same civilization. We should be together. And Russia also wants a buffer against Western expansion. And part of that is the experience of having been invaded by Germany in 2 world wars, which is an understandable concern. However, it ignores the fact that the way Russia has has ruled its neighbors has led them to feel insecure about Russian rule. I mentioned last month that under the Soviet Union, Stalin, his plans led to the deaths of 3 million people in a famine in Ukraine.
Wow.
I mean, this is genocide.
Stay tuned we'll talk more about that, Richard, right after this break.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back to the Millennial Roundtable. I'm Chelsea Yeoman, your host, and I am joined by Richard Lim and Liberty McCarter, and we're really discussing some of the escalating events that are happening in Russia and Ukraine. There's a lot of proxy war to unpack there, and that truthfully, it naturally will implicate Europe. And some of the rhetoric that I wanted to highlight for us today is the fact that Putin, I think I saw this video come out yesterday or maybe the day before, said essentially it's inevitable that if Ukraine joins NATO, that he will be at war with Europe. And he also, the other escalating rhetoric that I saw was he openly discussed nuclear arms, which, shocked me. He's definitely beating his chest. and Europe could respond. They could respond by shutting down the natural gas pipeline, which President Biden mentioned. But Germany heavily relies on that, and that would be at a detrimental economic impact to Europe. And so it seems like a bit of a catch-22 in some sense. So, Richard, I wanted to get your input. Did you see President Putin's statements yesterday? And do you think that there's, actions behind his words, or is he simply trying to apply more pressure to keep Ukraine close?
Well, I think that in these kind of situations, you're seeing both sides find ways to deter the other side. So Putin is saying what he's saying, and he knows that in previous actions, the fact that he has invaded Georgia, the fact that he's already invaded Ukraine and taken the Crimea in 2014, that his actions mean something, and so his words mean something. And so I think what you're seeing is the classic saber rattling in order to cower the other side. And one thing I want to say also is that there's a reason why these countries in Eastern Europe don't want to be ruled by Moscow. And I mentioned basically the Ukrainian Holocaust that happened in the 1930s as a result of that. I think oftentimes people just say, oh, well, a country like Ukraine just needs to accept its destiny as a satellite of Russia. And I think it's easy to say that if you don't have to live under Russian rule specifically. So, with Putin, he's not somebody that you can take what he says lightly.
I think it's one thing that to look at this from our limited perspective. I am not the international relations scholar that maybe you are, but I also have to take note of the fact that these escalations I haven't seen occur as much during President Trump's reign or even President Bush's reign, who famously was personal friends with President Putin and had him out to his ranch and personal home many, many times, and I can't help but wonder if who our president is and President Biden's administrative response to these escalations, do you think it's fanning the flames?
Well, the reason why this is happening is because Putin senses weakness. So the problem started a long time ago. It started when Joe Biden took office. But I will have to say that of the four previous presidents, including the current president, the one president that Putin didn't expand Russian territory was under President Trump. And there's a reason for that, because Trump in many ways was unpredictable in foreign policy, but that's an advantage because your enemies are your adversaries are less willing to test your limits if that's the case.
Yes, Liberty, I want to go to you real quick and just see, was there anything before we move on to our next topic that you wanted to add to our discussion?
Well, I have been getting quite an education from Richard because foreign policy is not my realm either. But I will just say, reading this Wall Street Journal article you posted about how a lot of Russians, they are just kind of buying the propaganda of U.S. as the aggressors, but kind of focused on other things. It's just a reminder to me that it's easy to hear something and to take it for granted of, oh, yeah, that's the way it is, but I've got my own life to deal with. And we really, need to dig in and say, am I being fed the truth, or do I need to look deeper into this and try to find out what's going on? So worldwide lesson, true for everybody everywhere.
It is true. And it's good for us to be equipped with this information because the world is still, spinning out there, in addition to all of our domestic policies we have here. So sometimes I like to highlight what is happening in these other parts of the world because it is relevant to us. I mean, this will impact where our troops are. If there are economic sanctions involved, that impacts our economy, not to mention, I would say even just Americans abroad. So those are all reasons we like to highlight this, that President Biden and his foreign policies so far have been a debacle, and to continue to keep that at the forefront of your mind. Other news outlets may not be reporting on this, but we certainly want you to be made aware of it. One other thing we're going to turn to now is something that, Richard, you called me about a few weeks ago. So passionate. I said we have to dedicate a mini segment to this topic, and that is President's Day. We have a lot of presidents to be proud of. America is, after all, a great and extraordinary country. I tell my sons every time we pass the American flag that America is the best country in the world, and it's because we're free. And so I'm going to highlight that here. Richard, I'd love for you to just take a few minutes here and tell our listeners what you were telling me about the significance historically of President's Day.
Sure, yes, thank you. So one thing I want to say to all listeners right now is that you have been lied to your whole life. There is no such thing as President's Day, at least as far as a national holiday, a federal holiday goes. According to federal law, the holiday on the third Monday of February is named Washington's birthday. And Washington's birthday has been a national holiday since 1879. At the time, his birthday was celebrated on Washington's actual birthday, which was February 22nd every year. February 22nd, that's actually even complicated on its own because in the middle of his life, they changed the calendar. So he was actually born on February 11th, but they added 11 days. Whatever. He himself celebrated his birthday February 22nd, which was a national holiday. But in 1968, Congress passed a law moving the several holidays to Mondays because they wanted Americans to have the 3-day weekend. Well, Washington's was one of those, so it was delinked from his actual birthday, and some wanted to tie it to Lincoln's birthday, which was on February 12th, which is all well and fine. Lincoln was obviously a great president. Some congressmen, though, warned that by changing the date of Washington's birthday, that would lead people to forget the significance of Washington himself. And that's exactly what happened. Congress moved it in between Washington and Lincoln's birthday, and mattress salesmen saw that, it was close, it was in between both, so car and mattress salesmen and whoever, a bunch of people selling stuff, and they renamed it to the snappier President's Day. Why does this matter? Well, according to law, two men's birthdays are national holidays, Washington's and Martin Luther King's. We don't celebrate Civil Rights Leaders Day. We celebrate Martin Luther King Day. But instead of celebrating Washington's birthday, we've lumped him in with the Millard Fillmores and the Jimmy Carters of the world, which I think is just a disservice. Now, in India, they have a day to celebrate Gandhi, their founding father. In Ecuador, they have, and other countries in Latin America, they have a day to celebrate Simón Bolívar. Japan has a day to celebrate the Meiji Emperor. Mexico has a day for Benito Juarez.
One minute, Richard.
I know, we have a guy just as, if not more awesome than all of them. I know that, some people might be offended by that.
He is worth, you are absolutely right. He is worth noting. So on this President's Day, listeners, remember Richard's voice in your head that it is President George Washington, our first President's Day. He led the revolution valiantly for our freedom, and that is worth noting and remembering. Richard, where can our listeners learn more about you?
Absolutely. So this American President podcast on February 22nd, which is when we celebrate Washington's birthday, that we will release an episode on his farewell address to celebrate George Washington. So check it out, February 22nd, This American President.
Thank you so much, Richard. Thanks for joining us on the show today.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.